Welcome to part 2 of our public information session for Smart Growth Overlay District, also known as Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 40R. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jay Green. I'm the town administrator, so I'll be your master of ceremonies moderator tonight. We have a few guests with us tonight. We have one new guest. Can I just see I recognize a few faces. How many were here for the last session that we had in September? Okay, and anyone who's new tonight, that'll just help us decide. Gail, I think you were here last
At
time.
the very end.
Very,
I got the
okay.
last 10 minutes or so.
Hi, Mike, I didn't see you before. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is we have a PowerPoint presentation that essentially will answer all your questions about, or at least the majority of your questions about 40R. What is 40R? How does 40R work? What are the nuts and the bolts of it? As a result of some feedback that we got, thank you, George, as well as from some folks from the first meeting, we want to answer some questions that really only a developer can answer. And we have with us tonight Mr. Dave Carver. In respect to Dave and our other guests, unlike the last meeting, we'd really like to keep this to about an hour, hour and a half if possible, out of respect for everybody that's coming to speak with us. So we're going to move through this as promptly as we can and answer as we can thoroughly any questions. Rather than jumping into the PowerPoint first, which is really for our new folks so you understand what 40R is, we're going to start with Dave. I have some questions to ask Dave tonight as a developer to help you understand a little bit and us understand as a community. How does 40R kind of fit into the development world? 40R is a zoning tool. It is used by a community in order to permit particular projects, mixed-use projects. Mixed-use being residential. Think Berkshire Mills, first floor commercial, all the floors up residential. But you have to understand 40R, we have to understand 40R in the context of what it actually is, and that is economic development. So we thought it was helpful to have a developer. So Dave doesn't do this often, so Dave, thank you for participating tonight. Do you want to give a quick introduction as to who you are and your experience, Dave? We'll launch right into some of the questions.
Sure. My name is Dave Carver. I'm affiliated with CT Management Group and Scarafoni Associates. We are a real estate management development company. Been operating up and down Berkshire County since probably the early 80s. So I'm kind of at the end of my career, but we're still very active. I don't know anything about 40R, but I do know a little bit about real estate, so I'm here to answer any questions that you pose.
Thanks, Dave.
Proceed.
Thank you. We also did invite a few other developers, and one of the reasons why we finally chose tonight, we just couldn't get everybody together on the same day. It's very difficult to try to get everyone scheduled together. So we had one other developer who I was giving until 6 o'clock on the dot. He had family plans tonight. We have to understand that. So Dave was thankfully able to join us. Dave, do you have any projects in Adams itself, any properties?
We do. We haven't developed and invested in anyone lately, but we have some affordable housing. We have 2 USDA projects which are affordable. We have on French Street we have 8 units, and back in the early 80s or mid 80s we developed the old Hoosick Street School on Hoosick Street, and we continue to own and manage that property. That's 12 units. Those are the 2 active developments. Years ago we bought and developed the Plunkett Hospital and converted and sold all those units. I think there's 16 units there as privately owned condominiums.
So some of the questions that we've been asked as town staff is, how are development projects typically financed in the Berkshires? And we're just talking generality. Where do you look for financing? Do you do it yourself? What are the pros and cons of using an incentive program where you have to deal with a government entity versus not? We've had a lot of conversation about how would a developer use 40R versus not use 40R. Just that's not anything we can answer because it's not our side of the house.
Well, it depends. There are different types of developers that have interests in different areas. There are a lot of developers that absolutely specialize in affordable housing, low-income housing. We have a portfolio. We haven't built on that lately, but there are some that specialize in that, and most of that financing comes from government sources. You start with a government source, and then you may layer on some private equity and some private banking on top of that. But the other developers, and we drifted in that direction, is to try to completely privately finance our developments, and we use local banks and our own equity.
Why do you try to do it privately versus using public funds? be
Well,
honest?
because we are focusing on private market housing right now in most of our investments, and so the private banks are the ones that we work with.
What can a community do, such as Adams, or frankly any other community in the Berkshires, do to entice you as a developer to come to town? We want CT Management to come to town to develop a property, put it on the tax rolls, bring people in, expand the tax base. What can we do as a community, just generally speaking, to entice a developer to come to town?
Well, first of all, if a town, provides incentives, that's a very powerful thing for a developer to feel welcome. But beyond that, ultimately, the developer has to look at demand. And I think that's where a lot of small towns struggle with demand. If it's affordable housing, the demand is always there if the government throws money at it. But if it's private market housing, you really have to base it on what are the market rents and what are the costs of construction. And that's where we have difficulty, because there's a big disconnect between the cost of privately building an apartment or a house and what the rents are. There's a big disconnect. And so when we find an interesting project to do, there's immediately a gap. So we work to close that gap. And that's a struggle, and that's where a town can come in and using 40R or other tools to close that gap to the point where it makes sense. But that's most developers working on housing up and down the county are having that difficulty. You start with a huge gap, you work with the town and the banks and investors to see if you can close the gap.
One of the things, Dave, that we've talked about here a lot is competition among the region. And we're trying to situate Adams so that we're competitive with other towns, other communities in the region. We see a lot of development in North Adams, we see some development in Pittsfield. And in my short time here, 6, 7, 8 months now at this point, I've had a lot of people say, Jay, we've got to get development here in Adams. How do we do that? We feel in town staff, and speaking with the folks that have done all the research on this, our select board, et cetera, they look at this as a tool in the toolbox. And again, generally speaking, if North Adams were to adopt 40R, or any other incentive program for that matter, and you have a similarly situated building in North Adams, you have a similarly situated building in Adams, as a developer, which community are you going to go to first in order to make it reasonable for you, financially smart for you to develop? And again, that's a general.
They're both very, very similar communities in terms of history and culture, so, and they both have the same types of older historic housing stock, so I think they're both equally as attractive. Ultimately, it comes down to cost.
So an incentive program would help you
Absolutely.
swing that pendulum one way.
There's no question about it.
Generally speaking, and this is going to help me too as town administrator, so this is why I'm asking this. When you sit back and you look at a property portfolio, if you were to want to take on a new development project, is Adams in and of itself attractive, or what is it that you look at? Speaking about Adams now specifically, what is it that you would look at if you wanted to decide to come to Adams or not decide to come to Adams? What are almost the check boxes that you would look at a community, other than demand, as you said before, for housing?
Yeah, no, demand is absolutely very important. We're looking at market rate housing. We're downtown developers. Our interest has always been buying older buildings and renovating them for either office use, retail, mostly residential. You need buildings that have good bones, good structure, and parking. And beyond that, it's a question of numbers. If the acquisition price is too high, it puts it out of the reach of market rate housing.
Also with us tonight is Jonathan Butler from One Berkshire, also town resident, so I'm grateful for Jonathan to be here. We also have Don Dugendorf. Don and Jonathan both participated in our last public information session. Don has represented both municipalities on one side and developers on the other side. And so while we're in the context of this conversation and we have some time, Jonathan or Don, anything that you want to dovetail with Dave in terms of the more global or regional aspect of development? And then getting into a little bit about how Dave hasn't done a 40R project, but how 40R would play into this.
I think one of the assessments that developers have to make is they have to wrestle with not just demand, but permitting uncertainty. the two risk elements in that statement about permitting uncertainty are time and money. How much soft cost do I have to invest before I know I'm making a sound investment? And how much time is it gonna take me to get from here to there? We in the Commonwealth have home rule for zoning. And towns in many ways have used zoning to create gates or moats around their communities, either intentionally or unintentionally. But we've done that. And one of the things that attracts me to the 40R notion is that we can change the risk dynamic by saying certain projects are by right. You've got a development plan review process that you're going to have in this bylaw that's being proposed. You're going to have design standards. But if you meet those, you have much more certainty about both of those vectors of time and money, soft costs and money. Soft costs don't make developers any money. They just don't, especially time spent on lawyers and engineers in the permitting process, or wetlands consultants. They don't make them any money. Those are pure risk dollars. And if we can change the risk dynamic by saying certain outcomes are by right, we've done a very powerful thing to make Adams more attractive, in my opinion. That's key to it. I think if we do that better here in Adams than they do somewhere else, we have a leg up, in my opinion, because we changed that risk dynamic. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is, I think that's true.
Yeah. That's how I think about it.
John, what's your take?
So, just for those of you that aren't familiar with our organization, One Berkshire, we're the Regional Economic Development and Business Organization. So, the role we often play in the housing side of economic development is kind of a connective tissue role between the municipalities, the developers interested in projects, sometimes the state, and some of those incentive programs that are accessed. So we work with teams like David's really all around the county. So I'll speak a little bit to what David said about demand, because demand ultimately drives these investments. What we know in the Berkshires right now is that our economy has shifted pretty substantially in the last 5 to 10 years. We're actually in what we call a hiring economy. We have more jobs available than we have qualified workforce for those jobs. That's a reality. It's very different than the narrative we had 25 years ago. So what that means is a lot of the employers are hiring, and they're actually recruiting people into the region. General Dynamics, Berkshire Health Systems, the colleges, even law enforcement and municipalities to an extent are involved in that game. When people are coming into the region, what do they want? Generally, they want to rent. They want quality housing. So that's driven a spike in demand in housing in the last few years. And it's a couple different tiers. Up north here in Adams and North Adams, and certainly also in Pittsfield, there's quite a bit of demand for market rate housing. And that's it's professionals, that's families, that's empty nesters, folks that are ready to sell their home and move into an apartment downsize. And those are people with the capacity to pay market rate. And right now we know in the region that we're not keeping up with the demands for that particular audience. There's also a demand for affordable housing. And when we say affordable housing, Jane will talk more about this in the presentation later. That isn't a voucher program, that isn't Section 8. Those are that's the tier below market rate housing where there's some control over cost. And generally the people that live in affordable housing units are younger professionals that are making, say, under $50,000 a year as an individual. And that's school teachers, that's new hires at General Dynamics, that could be your police officers or your firemen. Or it's families making under $75,000 a year, which again could be like 2 young professionals that are just starting their careers. So that particular audience blends well with the market rate housing audience. And in this area, we have demand for both. In the region, that overall demand is real. We know we're several hundred units behind, probably in both categories. And where the question then becomes is, where is the best place for a developer to turn to meet that demand? And that's when things like the incentive packages or those toolboxes that municipalities have are so important. What it does matter in that case, what Great Barrington is offering, or Dalton is offering, or North Adams is offering in comparison to what Adams is offering. Our economy here in the Berkshires, and I know things can get very localized when you live in your town and you work in your town. I had that perspective when I was actually in Jay's position a few years ago here in Adams. But ultimately, our economy it's a countywide fishbowl. It's not a fishbowl of Adams or a fishbowl of North Adams. So when you think about these types of toolboxes and incentive packages in the way that your community can position yourself to respond to that demand, it's not always just a question about what's best for Adams, it's a question about what's best for Adams as you compete with your neighboring communities so that Adams can benefit from that demand. So I'll just leave that there for questions later on.
Okay. Dave, you've got some new projects going on in Pittsfield. Can you just talk very briefly about them and really what made you decide to give those projects a green light?
Yeah, to add to what Jonathan was saying, that we're seeing a completely different demand curve on where people want to live and work, and we're seeing a decidedly a big move towards young people wanting to live in a downtown. That wasn't the case years ago. Even active seniors are willing to live in a downtown if it's accompanied with, as I said, parking, cultural activities, restaurants. And we're seeing that happen in Pittsfield. It's coalescing a little bit over the last 20 years. And the combination of market rate housing and restaurants and cultural activities, on top of keeping the solid businesses there, seem to be working, not just in Pittsfield, but even in big cities like Boston, New York. People are now living in downtown. Half of Wall Street now used to be office space. It was all office space. Half of it is now market rate housing, whether it's condominiums or rental apartments. So that same dynamic should work in Pittsfield, North Adams. So a program like this that actually recognizes that and provides incentives to keep the downtown strong and dense and leave the countryside alone, that's another conversation, is very helpful.
Just one comment. I just sort of a proof point on demand. I've been doing this for 42 years. I helped permit the cable mill project in Williamstown. I was stunned at how quickly that project filled. They had a waiting list before they opened, and within 5 months, that was full. I mean, it was extraordinary. And it taught me, it sort of verified the comments that are being made by David and Jonathan about the quality of that demand. These people are mobile. They're interested in a different style of living. Home ownership is less important. They don't want to mow the lawn, and they don't want to wash windows, and they don't want to call West Oil to fix the burner. They want something different. And that dynamic is real, and I saw it sort of very up close in that particular instance.
Yeah, we're seeing it in the projects in Pittsfield. I mean, it's not just the young professionals that are working at General Dynamics, and there are hundreds of them. And they're all struggling to find a place to live in our downtown because they may be coming from a city like Boston where housing like that is everywhere. So there's a big demand. I've been saying for the last couple of years, there's probably another demand for another 250 units right on North Street alone, in the old historic buildings that make charming housing. Probably you just have to figure out a way to make the numbers work. Now, Pittsfield has some tools, you know, they have some tools and it's working. But if we can, and there's 3 or 4 other developers that are doing this, and if we can hit a rent range between $1,500 and $1,800 a month, with parking nearby, a nice 2-bedroom unit, they will fill up all day long. There's probably demand instantly for probably 250 units. And again, it's not just young people. We have older retired folks that are living in downtown Pittsfield now, in downtown North Adams as well.
We've heard a little bit, we've got a few more minutes to keep Dave and I'm going to carry loose. We've heard a little bit, at least the constituents that I talked to have said, Jay, yeah, housing, but what about jobs? We have a lot of jobs here in town, people live here in town. Then I've talked to other constituents and they've said, Adams has always been a bedroom community. You couldn't even get out on the Route 8 between 3 and 5 o'clock because of the shift work. Can you just explain a little bit of the dynamics, and perhaps Jonathan, I'll toss the ball to you to start off with. Just the working dynamics now of the Berkshires that we can't, and you touched upon it a little bit, but can you answer that for some of our folks that are asking that question? Why housing, why not jobs?
Sure. So, again, we're very much one economy. General Dynamics employs people from all around the Berkshires. Our cultural institutions employ people from all around the Berkshires. The college is the same. Our corporate park in Adams, which is a very successful local business story, does the same. Their employees aren't all from Adams. Many of them come from North Adams and Williamstown or Southern Berkshire County, Southern Vermont. So when we talk about jobs, I know it's 2 conversations. On the local level, you're thinking about bringing taxes into the community, getting that business commercial tax rate, bringing more revenue that way. So that matters, but from the perspective of the regional economy, and this is where an organization like us kind of becomes agnostic, because we're countywide, we're trying to make the Berkshires economy stronger. the net impact of a company expanding with 50 jobs, whether that happens in southern Berkshire, northern Berkshire, or central Berkshire, is the same for the economy, the Berkshire's economy. But again, it comes down to what are you doing in your own community. So one of the things that I would say is, to separate housing a little bit from that is, it's great when you can bring in new jobs into your economy, but right now we know that the demand is more for workforce rather than jobs. If you were to bring in a new employer to Adams with 50 new jobs, filling those 50 jobs would actually become the first challenge, depending on what industry that was in. But if you were to bring 50 or 100 new people that are employed elsewhere into Adams, that are paying rent in an affordable unit, a market rate unit, or they're buying a home, their children are going to go to the schools, which helps the school system's picture. They're going to pay taxes, or they're going to pay into a conglomerate that pays taxes at some level, and ultimately that's an economic strengthener for any community. So I always get a little leery when people talk about, well, we need more jobs in our community. I would say we need to meet the workforce needs that exist in the Berkshires. We need to continue to support diversification of our economy in the Berkshires, but I don't think anything is a lower hanging fruit or opportunity for a municipality than enticing more people to come live in your community. Whether they work in another community or not, if they live in your community will feel a great benefit from that.
I totally agree, and I think that's something that communities have control over more than jobs or for example, retail. As a owner of a lot of investment property, I can tell you we don't pay a lot of attention to marketing retail space. Even the big boys can't figure it out. But we can have a huge impact with cities and towns as partners to create housing. That's something we can do locally using tools that the state has, using tools that the town has themselves, and interest from developers. That's something we can control. There are a lot of things we don't control. We can't control. Jobs leaving the area, jobs leaving the country. We can't control that, but we can have a big impact on housing and improving the visible impact of our community. That's something else that our old mill town should be doing, is working on blight. We're getting smaller, and it's painful on the way down. All towns are doing that throughout the Berkshires. When I came here in the early 80s, it was 150,000. I think we're under 130 now. So let's not worry about the size of our communities. I think we should worry about the quality of our communities. And then maybe over time, if we do that and improve and get rid of the blight, maybe we're situating ourselves for some growth in the future.
But UMass just, an economist at UMass, Clayton Matthews, I think is his name, just issued a report summarized by Globe and the Journal, I think. And he said that the biggest single impediment to economic growth in Massachusetts is the lack of housing options for its people. The single biggest statewide challenge is the housing challenge. I mean, it is a lead indicator for these kinds of things about community health and otherwise. So it's an interesting correlation.
And as we learned last time, Don, when you spoke, that was the genesis for Chapter 40R to begin with, is that correct?
Yeah.
Because of the housing shortage that we have in the state.
Could I ask Don a question?
Yes, we're at 6:23. I want to keep this to 6:30 for Dave, who's welcome to stay if you'd
Yeah.
like. So any questions in the context of developers while we have Dave? Because I can't answer, none of us can really answer the developer side. That's a specialized one. So go ahead, John.
Could I ask him a question?
Please.
Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave, are you doing any 40-hour work in Pittsfield?
We are not. There are several. There's a tool that the city of Pittsfield has, and it's a Gateway Cities program. It's probably similar. It's going after the same thing, and
Is it under 40B then?
it's not 40B. This is a very specific program for cities in the Commonwealth that are over 35,000 people.
Under a separate program?
It's under a separate program.
The one that Gail Caridi a couple of years ago
No,
was the instrument?
there's only 13 communities in the Commonwealth, I think. Is that correct, Jonathan?
I think they expanded it. I think it's 21 or 22
It is 21,
now.
but
They're all incentives specific to those communities.
correct. The criteria is that your city or town needs to be 35,000 people or over, and they created a program that is specifically and only for market rate housing.
And North Adams, the work that you've done there has been either 40B or strictly private?
Strictly
Strictly
private.
private.
So this new program that they started about 7 or 8 years ago, we're using right now the St. Mary's complex, And it's a tax credit that allows us to attract private investment money to close that gap. So St. Mary's Complex on Tyler Street in Pittsfield is 4 beautiful buildings. They were gonna tear it down for Dunkin' Donuts. Thankfully, that did not happen. We're gonna convert it to 29 market rate units, strictly market rate, no low-income housing. And so we had a gap that, if you run the numbers, the rents were gonna be $2,500, $3,000 a month. That may be fine in Boston, but it doesn't work in Pittsfield. So using this program that allows us to raise private equity money, we were able to get the rents down to $1,500 to $1,800 a month for, and we're saving 4 beautiful, beautiful buildings. But that program is similar, the goal is similar to 40R. It's just Pittsfield's a bigger city and it's just a little.
And it's the only one in Berkshire County, so then the rest of them are all in other counties.
Yes, Pittsfield is the only gateway city in Berkshire County because of its size.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any questions for Dave? For Jonathan, Don on the development side of it?
Got a couple in the back too.
Let's go, George, please.
Yes, I'm interested in your work with zoning. You know, you're working with high-density zoning. Do you work with high-density zoning, or you work with the zoning, existing zoning?
The last 4 or 5 projects that we've done have been in Pittsfield residential. We're buying buildings, converting them, adaptive reuse. And the zoning permitted the housing and our density did not exceed what they allowed. So they were basically site plan reviews. So we do our homework ahead of time. I really don't want to spend a lot of time and money arguing with neighbors or zoning. If it doesn't fit, then we'll move on to something else. But we've been fortunate in the developments we've done in Pittsfield that they fit and the neighbors are fine with it. And
So the zoning isn't an issue so much for you? It's mostly cost and demand.
It's strictly cost. If there's a project that we're interested, we discover that there's neighborhood opposition or there's other issues, there's just so many other things that we can do. We'd rather not spend our time and money on, as Don was saying, soft costs. You really can't recover that. So we want to put all our time and effort into brick and mortar. Soft costs, I don't understand. It just creates issues. It makes it harder to make the numbers work. So what Don was saying is if a program like this can eliminate 10% of your development budget because you don't have to spend this time and money on all these soft costs, it can go into brick and mortar and help make the numbers work.
So a hypothetical, if Adams had 40R on several buildings here in town, and those buildings were available for your company to look at buying and maybe developing, would that change your opinion of the building at all?
To the extent that the zoning eliminates soft costs, absolutely, yes.
But primarily it would be demand and cost.
Correct. Step 1 is the building available? Step 2, is there any opposition to using the building for our intended use? And if you have to work down the checklist. And then and only then do we actually start doing the numbers. Because even if the numbers work, if it's not something that the neighborhood wants, we're just not interested.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, you have a question? Don?
Mr. Carver, are you familiar with Mass Works? It's a infrastructure grant.
I'm not. Most of our work in the last 10 or 15 years has not involved government funding except for what we're using with the city of Pittsfield under the Gateway Cities program. But so I've heard of all these programs, but I'm not really, I haven't used them.
Yeah, they used it in that new complex in East Hampton, 1 Ferry Street.
Yeah, there are many programs. There's probably 20 that you could put in a toolbox to do, but quite frankly, they purport to give you a benefit, but at the end of the day, you add it all up, guess what? You know what? They said you're gonna get a 10% benefit, it costs you 15% in administration dealing with it. So, like the historic tax credits, that's a prime example. They will give you 10, 20% tax credit, but when you add it all up at the end of the day, sometimes it costs you more than 10 or 20% to deal with the paperwork and the changes they want you to make on the building, and you lose a lot of economic freedom. So that's my personal experience, my personal opinion. It's a very good program for someone that needs to make it work that way.
John? Mr. Cowgill?
Okay. Dave, was the Hoosick Street development, was that considered affordable housing or market rate?
The one right up the street?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's affordable housing all the way. It's a USDA 515 program, and it is low-income housing.
So it's low-income housing?
Yes, it is.
So people who have vouchers,
Yes, they can.
state vouchers, can
Yes.
live there?
Yes.
And so when we talk about affordable versus market rate, you mentioned $1,500 to $1,800 as market rate housing,
That's a
roughly?
number that if you can stay in that range in Berkshire County, that is doable.
Right.
The struggle is, it may cost $250,000 to $350,000 to build a high-quality market rate housing. If you're dealing with government housing, the numbers are meaningless because the government just throws money at it with grants, loans, interest loans to drive the rents down to affordable level. But when you're dealing with private bank financing, you know, that's.
And I understand that. And that's one of the issues, I think. It's called smart growth overlay. But having done research on it, it's basically about dense population. The ability to put lots of people in a small area, i.e. Boston, you need teachers, you need firemen, you need service workers. The cost of housing has escalated far beyond what those people could afford. And so now they're changing the zoning, the overlays, to be able to have more people in a dense population. And one of the buildings that's in the smart overlay is the Hoosick Street, 7 Hoosick Street. And the numbers are going to be off here because I don't know if they were talking 150 or 180 units.
It depends on the developer. We've heard 110, 120, it all depends if it's 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, or 1-bedroom.
Right.
As Dave will explain to you, there's a cost per development, per cubic foot on the type of design.
Correct.
So all of that goes into how the developer finances that project, as I'm learning. So if 40R is passed, then perhaps he can include more 3-bedrooms because the finances make sense. Let's say there's no incentive program, he still decides to do it, he may choose to put in more units in order to make that cost. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
But on the other side of that is that there's no cap, there's no cap on what the developers can make. So if he can sell more X units, and it could be affordable Section 8 housing, and put more units in and reap more money, that might be advantageous to him as well.
Actually,
we're gonna get it. Go ahead.
Because under 40R, they have to be between 20% and 40% of the units can be affordable. They can't exceed 40% and it can't be below 20%. So they can't just maximize the incentive.
Right, so if we take 150 units, so 40% could be Section 8 housing, correct? Is that
No,
what
I
you're
think
saying?
40R is not Section 8 housing. 40R is affordable housing, which is a classification up to certain thresholds. Section 8 is below that, and that's where you actually get vouchers.
But if
Section
it's
8
a
Section 8
federal
housing-
program,
Section 8 housing doesn't qualify under 40R.
This is not a federal program. This is a state program,
state program.
and it is not a Section 8 program.
So one of the issues that you talked about was the risk dynamics, I think you mentioned. And we have a zoning board here. And if the soft costs are involved with the zoning and the labors and all of that, it seems to me that our zoning board can handle that. Now, Dave, you've worked with zoning boards in Pittsfield, North Adams, Williamstown, and long ago you worked here. Where was it easy to work? I'm going to put you on the spot, I know. And I know zoning boards
All the
change.
same, only because before we get there, we do homework, and we're not going to
Okay.
approach or propose a project that we haven't vetted ahead of time to make sure that there's not a lot of controversy.
One of the concerns that I have is, I think for me personally, if this wasn't a 30-year commitment, I'd be going, hey, let's try this. This could be okay. But a 30-year commitment, giving away the store for the money, the potential money that can come in, I have a real problem with that. I think that our zoning board can handle the issues that seem to come up. Some of the overlay districts, we've had the school, the high school, RFPs. How many RFPs have come in on that? None. We've had that for a long time. You wanna?
Yeah, let me speak to a couple of things you addressed.
Right, Gail, you said earlier, you walked in towards the last part
Right.
of the last meeting. You
Yep.
addressed a lot of this stuff. And to
Mm-hmm.
be honest with you, some of the
Concerns?
information that you just said is based on is incorrect. So what I think we want to do is, why don't we start getting into this, which will
So
answer some of your
specifically what's
questions.
incorrect, because I'd like to.
We're gonna
correct it.
move ahead with the PowerPoint, which will answer your questions, so we
Okay.
can explain what 40R is, because I think at this point, we're starting to get into the nuts and bolts, and I'd like to lay out exactly what 40R is for everybody. So Don, just get ready to jump in as we go. What we're gonna talk about, what exactly is smart growth overlay districts. Gail touched upon it a little bit. We're gonna talk about what it is, we're gonna talk about why for Adams, and then we're gonna talk about some of the nuts and bolts, particularly what that affordable definition is. So what are smart growth overlay districts? Don, you wanna just go ahead, same thing you did last time, because it worked really well? Talk about the density, we talked about why 40R came about.
Yeah.
Mixed use.
We've alluded to it. Some people call it a housing crisis, other people call it housing opportunity. It is not the same animal statewide. Adams has a past that still lives here. We've got some extraordinarily spectacular mill buildings and other buildings that we want to preserve. We want to preserve and want to reuse. There are high costs and uncertainties attached to those efforts. And what Donna and her team at Town Hall have done is tried to look at those properties specifically and say, how can we bring folks like Dave Carver to consider those? How do we bring private capital to consider helping us bring new life to our past? I think that's one of the tools that 40R presents to us. It's a dynamic thing. At the core of it is a very simple notion. I want to just respond to the comment in the back room. ZBAs do three things. They issue special permits, they issue variances, and they hear appeals from decisions by zoning enforcement officers. In Adams, it's the building inspector. At the heart of 40R are these uses deemed to be by right. They will be subject to design review in the bylaw and, by the way, required by state law, and that's like a site plan review. The difference between a special permit or a variance process and a by right is no matter how good the ZBA is and how well they write their decision, there are opportunities for people to attack or delay the project by appealing it, etc. By right, very hard to appeal. Special permits granted by a zoning board of appeals are considered by courts to be discretionary. Variances are considered by courts to be very strictly construed. So there are opportunities for the kinds of things that I talked about with risk profile, risk dynamics, for delays based on appeals. And I've had projects delayed and killed by appeals. So it's not just a question of how the talent and ability of your local ZBA. At the core of this are specific properties, specific areas of the town. They're called eligible in the state statute. You can't have it everywhere. It has to be a specific overlay. And at the core of that is a series of well-defined, and the bylaw that's proposed does that, well-defined sets of uses or outcomes that are desired by the bylaw in the town of Adams ultimately. And it's targeted at these buildings. The balance of, there are other features associated with it, but what it's done, it's tried to make changes to the way we accommodate, particularly in Adams and other towns like us, how we accommodate a way to bring new life to our past. These buildings that meant so much at one time, we need to reinvest in them. We need to find ways to attract capital to them. If we don't, they deteriorate. They become elephants, white or otherwise, but they become elephants and don't serve our town and its populace. So I think what Donna and her team have done is tried to craft this fairly carefully to address that, and at the core of it is a chance to change the dynamic about risk.
Donna, talk about, we have up here an overlay district.
Yes.
Well, what does that mean? The underlying zoning that already exists with our existing zoning laws does not change. If town meeting were to say, we will pass 40R, that overlays all of the components that come along with the 40R bylaws drafted by our planning board on top of that. The developer may choose to build a project under either 40R, smart growth, or they may choose to use the underlying zoning, which is the developer's choice as to, again, what will maximize the value and not have all those soft costs as they go along. So again, it is a tool, but it does not change that underlying development. I'm just gonna keep going, but save your thought, please. It does encourage mixed-use development, but does not require it. When we say mixed use, prime example is just here left out here, Berkshire Mills. That's a mixed-use example. It does require 20% of residential units to be affordable. Several months ago, there was a lot of conversation as to what is the definition of affordable, and we'll get into that a little later in this presentation. And it provides incentive payments to the town for approving a bylaw and for each housing unit that is developed. The reason why this exists, incentive payments, is because, as Don and Dave and Jonathan explained before, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts wants us as a community to consider this, and therefore incentivizes it. Furthermore, and I'm not sure if this point was really made, someone reminded me after the last public information session that we didn't discuss it, is the town of Adams receives substantial amount of money in grants, thanks to Donna and her team. But we have noticed, as these grants are coming in, there's a box, and the box says, has your community adopted 40R? Same question that goes on with wastewater treatment plant. Do you pay for your sewer plant by a fee structure or in your tax rate? This is how the state wants you to play, and unfortunately, we as a community have to acknowledge that. We have to look at that if we want to continue accessing all these grants. That's a component that we need to take into consideration. So that's one of the reasons why the state is going to give us these incentive payments, is because they want to see 40R passed. Anything to add to that, Don, or did I characterize that correctly? So why is the town of Adams considering this? Access to state incentive payments. The town receives an upfront payment of up to $600,000 just for adopting the bylaw. The town also receives $3,000 per unit that is actually developed. So there was some conversation back in August as to what these numbers actually mean, and we're going to explain them to you tonight. The state law says a town can get up to $600,000 just for adopting the bylaw. And Donna can explain it a lot in greater detail, but essentially it's an aspirational unit number. When we get into the actual zoning bylaw, you'll see that there are 4 districts within the bylaw, and there are particular properties identified within them. Based on a formula that is provided by the Department of Housing and Community Development, a state office, they want an aspirational number. If a project was built on this property, X amount of units could be built. That's how that number comes up. So you'll see a little later that the Community Development Office has identified about 629 units could aspirationally be built in the town of Adams. Therefore, simply by saying we could, in theory, build this number, the state is going to give us an incentive payment. If we decide to trim down the bylaw and reduce some of those properties, that number will come down. But what the Community Development Office did, and George, I'm trying to answer your question a little bit indirectly here, is the Community Development Office took a look at our inventory that we have, and they identified particular parcels that 40R would work on. Then they took that algorithm, they took that equation, laid over it, came up with those 629 units, and that's the number. Only 1 unit has to be built for us to keep the state money. 1 unit. That's it. So that was another question that we had. What do we have to do in order to keep it, or is there a risk to give it back? Obviously, that money would be, check would come in, we would keep that in a separate fund, and we would not dig too deep into that until we know for sure we are going to have a viable 40R project. The town also receives, or the municipality also receives, $3,000 per unit. So say, for example, Dave, to put you on the spot, and George, sorry, I'm gonna put you on the spot too. George is a property owner, Dave is a developer. Two of them come together and say, I want to build this project. They look at the underlying zoning, they look at 40R. They decide 40R makes sense for the economics for this. They build a unit with 10 apartments. $3,000 per unit, state says, here you go. If it was 2 units, here you go. That's how that works. The other reason why, in addition to taking advantage of the incentive payments, is to encourage the revitalization of existing buildings while protecting the character of existing neighborhoods, promote the economic health and vitality of the town by encouraging the preservation, reuse, renovation, and repurposing of underutilized historic structures. We're a quintessential mill town. I said this the last time. It's in our blood, it's in our heritage, it's how we do things. They're iconic. That building is beautiful, it's restored. We have other mill buildings here that need some revitalization. This is a tool to do that. This is a tool to put lights on in those buildings again. Maintain a consistent high level of design quality for new development in target areas. Encourage new development while protecting the character of existing neighborhoods. And make Adams a premier place to live, work, and play in the Berkshires. The first two, Gail, this is where I'm going to try to get back to your statements a little bit. And Don, I'm going to kick it to you. Under 40R, it permits by right zoning, which means, if, again, using my George and Dave analogy or example, Dave is going to come in and say, we're going to do this project. George says, I want this project. We can't say no as a community. It's by right. Housing can go onto this parcel that we've identified. But that doesn't mean it can just be built without a level of review. So Don, do you want to explain a little bit about that review process and how the community, to correct some of the misnomer that's out there,
Yeah,
40R actually gives the municipality control?
So we have had site plan review features of zoning law in the Commonwealth for as long as I've been practicing. So it's a long time, I'm getting old. And the way it works in most towns is it says, by right or otherwise, we want to see what you're doing. We want to be able to manage through this process impacts, and we want to see what you've done to mitigate impacts. Very standard. It's almost like an accounting procedure. What will happen under this bylaw is that we have what are called design standards, and they call out the impacts of development that we would be concerned about. And they say you will mitigate it in certain ways, and so you will build to certain design standards, and that's what this is about. It's not a yes or no, like a special permit might be. What it is, you don't proceed unless you complete the design review process. And some places it's called site plan review, other places called design review, but that's it in a nutshell. So that the applicant is not given a blank slate. Do whatever you want. And that's just is simply not appropriate, and the statute would never have used that kind of policy motivation to create this opportunity, this tool for the town. It is, in fact, requires you to erect a set of standards where you can judge the adequacy of the developers accounting for the impacts. David said one, parking. I can't build X number of units and everybody steal the available public parking. So it's very basic stuff that the bylaw addresses itself to. Bylaw that's proposed.
So it does not allow, that was some of the misnomers out there, it allows for review. The planning board will, if you read the bylaw's available online, bylaw's also available at town hall in hard copy, and that'll be the document the town meeting looks at as to decide whether or not to approve it. So that is the local control that we have. This isn't giving away the store or giving up control. In fact, it's regaining control. George, I saw your...
Yes, I want to point out though, by right, the number of units that are determined for the property is determined by the state. It's a square footage or acreage of the property, determines the unit number, right? And by right, the developer has the right to develop the maximum amount of units on that property. He may have to go through a design review. He may have to chop part of his property up and put more parking in to accommodate additional units. But you can't deny them the number of units that are allotted by 40R.
Okay, so let me speak to that. 40R erects only a minimum threshold for the housing mix. Only a minimum. It does not impose a max, it does not impose anything above.
It's not
a minimum.
imposing it. I didn't say it imposed it.
Oh, I thought you said it was done by the state law, I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
No, it's not determined that. What the state determines the number of units, and that number of units, the developer can develop to that many, or he can build less. But he can build to the maximum number of units based on square footage and acreage.
Well, I think you're mixing two pieces. Let me just, there's a density element to the state law and the bylaw. There's also a housing mix element. So those two are not the same. Donna, you could speak to that directly, I think, the way you crafted the
I
bylaw.
think the planning board has the ability
Sure
to
does.
condition and to mitigate impacts from this project, and some of that is to make the project smaller.
Sure.
That has to be
Yeah.
some of the ability of the planning board.
Yeah.
So,
So,
Sir, you had a question?
I've got a lot of questions, a lot of comments. You've all attested to the fact that demand is growing and it's very high for housing right now. Yet none of you have given us hard numbers on what we have already for housing and affordable housing in Adams. I'm a by the numbers kind of guy, and this is a very affordable place to live. And I think if ever there was a time for us to just let market forces take over, it's now. North Adams is bustling, Pittsfield is bustling. You've already said there's great demand. You work on demand, okay? I think the demand is going to carry this town to where it needs to go. I don't think 40R, which may take some control the way you describe it, and put it in the hands of the town, it takes away the abutters' rights. You're giving new developers overlay rights that they wouldn't have had otherwise. You talk about soft costs, Dave. There's some government programs you don't get involved in because you know that it costs you 15% to get 10% back. It's not a wise business decision. I don't think this is a wise business decision from a business point of view for the town to get involved in. I think the soft costs for this town are going to far outweigh any $600,000 or any other amount of money that we can get out of adopting 40R. And I think it will fundamentally change the character of this town to something that is less desirable and something that people don't want. I think if you took a show of hands of everyone in this room from all of the meetings, you would find overwhelming opposition to this bylaw. And I'd like you, all three of you, if you wish, to please address the business side of this from a business standpoint, from a businessman standpoint. Convince this group of people that this is worth adopting, and that 20 years from now, that this is going to be a profitable thing for this town. I don't do steroids. I don't think we need this shot in the arm. If you people think we do, you know, I'm not saying you're the doctors, but you're going to change this town. We're all taxpayers. We all live in this town.
Okay, why don't we
I don't
allow
think you
time
people
for
live here.
Donna,
So
go
let
ahead
me
first.
start with the first one,
Yeah.
the market. We do some interesting things with the market, and it's not pure in housing. Let me just start by saying that. We have a statewide building code. We have a statewide handicap access code. We have a statewide plumbing code, statewide electrical code.
I'm familiar with all
So,
that.
good. That erects a cost structure when you're attacking these opportunities. That cost structure is what David identified yields a gap in this marketplace. That gap is structural. You've got to figure out a way to cover it, or you won't get any return on capital. So it's a statewide, we're paying the same compliance costs that they do in Boston, here in Adams or Pittsfield or North Adams. That erects this cost element. The cost element is mismatched with the income, and there's a gap. That's the reality of housing in Berkshire County and elsewhere in Western Mass. That's the plain reality. So the market alone doesn't cure the problem, and yet the demand exists. So that's the first piece. You're trying to change the risk dynamic that I talked about, but even more important for David is that gap between costs and revenue. Simply there, and you've got to fix it. The reason I find this appealing for the town is it's a way to begin to address some of that. Not perfectly, still lots of work to do, but it's a way to do that. Other towns are doing it. The administrative costs of this for the town are I don't see them as very high. I don't see the administrative costs as very high. I do think the town meeting ought to assess the costs of not bringing capital to bear on the opportunities presented by the existing mill history of this town. I worry about that. I worry that without being more thoughtful about how we will revitalize those structures, I worry what happens to them in the future. Because of that gap problem and the structural element of the costs that are involved in development of that. So that's where I'm coming from. Those are the realities I'm just trying to think through with you all tonight.
And
So we get a
what's the
handle.
What's the long-term burden on our municipality for schooling, policing, fire protection, all that?
Yeah, I think if the returns to the town, you ask a fair question, if the returns to the town don't meet or exceed those additional costs, then you've all made a fool's bet. I get that. However, I have no lack of confidence in saying I don't think this is a fool's bet. I think that increased population base, increased activity for our retail and commercial outlets here in the town, the economic vitality drives tax revenue. I think getting to the 600,000 and what have you is not the big answer. It's a good answer, but not the best answer. But I think increasingly state policy, grant policy, that this town's been a great beneficiary of for a long time, I think will drive more and more of the thinking that way. So as I assess benefits and costs, I think this makes sense for the town of Adams. I'm not arguing with you, I just say that's the way I see it.
I want to keep pressing forward a little bit with the nuts and bolts of 40R and allow a little bit more time to address a few questions that may come up. Let's discuss the affordability component. A lot of misnomer about the affordability component, Section 8 versus affordable. This is not a federal program. This is a state program. The definition of affordability, no less than 20% of the developed housing units must be dedicated to eligible households. That means households with an income less than 80% of the area median income. So what are we talking about in nuts and bolts? The area median income, or AMI, is based on the Pittsfield, Massachusetts metropolitan area. So let me be clear, because this was a point I needed to have explained to me. We are not talking about the town of Adams' median income for our residents. When the state looks at this, the state says region-wise. So the median family income measured by the Pittsfield, Massachusetts metropolitan area is $80,000. That means if you are a single person earning an income, you are eligible for affordable housing if you make up to $49,700 a year annually. If you are two people, $56,800, and as you can see, it goes up. I'd like you to think just for a second who we're speaking about when we talk about 40R affordability component. We're talking about school teachers, municipal employees, police officers, etc., etc. think about how many people, when I started off as a prosecutor in the Berkshire DA's office, I made $37,500 a year with well over $150,000 in law school debt. I would have qualified for affordable housing. And I went to court every day with a suit and tie. So just think about these numbers. That's why we wanted to bring this up, because I think, sir, as you correctly said, it's easier to comprehend it when you know what the actual numbers are, particularly when you have empirical data that you can use. An individual in Adams could make up to $49,700 per year and qualify to live in an affordable unit under 40R. Family of four could make up to $70,950 per year and qualify. And according to the American Community Survey data, 22% of individuals and over 35% of families in Adams would qualify for the affordable component. Now, our bylaw specifically says, and we are beholden a little bit to the state that says no less than 20%. Our bylaw has capped the affordable unit component at 40%. So that number still holds if the development project, again, conversation between developer, conversation between landlord. What's our project going to look like? 15 units, 20 units, or 100 units? Those numbers still apply. Our bylaw doesn't just cut that number off. It provides a relief valve in case there's a conversation that says we have to move that 40% number. And that's just because the bylaw is well written. It's not a hard number, but the planning board has authority and would have to take a vote in order to change that.
Question,
Go ahead, Jim.
changing it up? Increasing to 40%?
Yes, that's what it says.
So in other words, if they build this, they were to build it, and the builder couldn't get the individuals who are not subject to that 80% rule, and enough of those individuals didn't come in, how high can you go?
That's a
It goes
question
back
for
to
the
the
planning
plan.
board. Goes to the
You could go
planning
back, so you could go 100%, arguably.
board. Is that the intent of the bylaw?
No, it's not the intent. It
But
would
is
have
that
to-
the way it works?
Pardon?
That's not whether it's the intent, it's whether that's the way, is that the way it could work?
It could be approved, a higher number of affordable, units could be approved by the planning board. We gave that discretion to the planning board
Right, and
in the bylaw.
if the builder couldn't fill it, and if you're saying, well, we're gonna cut it
No,
off
it
somewhere
would have
else,
to be
then
established.
in other words, he would have a building that could be half empty.
It would be
Which would bankrupt
established at
that
the
building.
time of planning board approval, those,
Yeah.
the ratio.
Go ahead, Don.
I think at the end of the day, I don't know a developer, I've never worked with one that plans for a half occupancy, 50% occupancy.
Well, like you
There's
said,
a-
demand is
There's a-
key.
No, but I talk about planning, and I also can tell you that I don't know of any developer that's working in this arena, particularly with historic rehab buildings, that would prefer affordable over market rate. I just don't. I wouldn't understand that dynamic, given the definitions of affordable here, et cetera.
It's not up to what,
Market rate, market rate implies
it's not a
low rent.
question of what he's thinking or what he wants, it's a question of demand. That's where your demand comes in. That's it, that's what's gonna rule.
You're not gonna get a bank to finance unless you can be very convincing about the quality of.
And if you could, there's existing programs now that could already be permitted with those number of units.
Yes, right,
They wouldn't even need to be under 40R.
yeah.
That
Right.
criteria already exists.
Right, 40B.
Yeah.
You could do 40B, like they could do
So
40B.
sort of, it's not necessarily connected to this 40R. A developer wouldn't have to go through all of that.
Right, 40B, they could do 40B right now, tomorrow. Why isn't it?
Well, that's why we're in the room tonight. This is a program that I think creates a
Well,
different
no,
set
why
of
isn't 40B?
incentives.
He bought it like 4 or 5 years ago, I don't remember.
See, that's,
We were there, when you remember,
It's a
you
good
gave
question,
him,
actually. That's-
you gave him permission to stand up, tell us he didn't want that, Ostrowski building out in front. We overpaid for that thing, because it was only assessed at about 72 grand. Okay, we paid what? It was over 100,000? 190.
50,000.
50,000.
okay, the planning process, where we are. Public input and the path to bylaw adoption and project development. process began with planning board workshop meetings. The planning board held a public hearing. The next step, after a planning board vote to move 40R on, which I believe is set for the first week of December, if I remember correctly, the Board of Selectmen will then move it on, they will deliberate and move it on to town meeting. That is the process. This is not an automatic process. We are a representative town meeting charter. That is how we were constructed. So town meeting finally votes on this. That's how the process will work. Project approval process under 40R. So what we want to talk about here is, let's say town meeting says 40R will go into place. Let's say we have a landlord, we have a developer who says we want to build a 40R project. What's that going to look like? An application for plan approval will be submitted to the planning board. Application then goes filed with the town clerk. Town clerk then takes it and disseminates it to all the required submittals. Board of Selectmen, Health, Conservation, Fire, Police, the Building Commissioner, and Public Works. Then goes to a public hearing process in the planning board. All the applications for a 40R project are required under the bylaw to meet the following criteria to be granted approval by the planning board. The applicant must submit the required fees and information required by the bylaw to the planning board. The applicant has to meet all those requirements and standards set forth in the bylaw, and the applicant must adequately mitigate significant adverse project impacts on nearby properties. I think that third bullet is probably the most important to highlight in terms of being in a butter, or if you're in a butter wondering that, ooh, what's going to happen next door to me if we do this as a community. The applicant must adequately mitigate significant adverse project impacts on nearby properties. So you will have the ability to step in there and comment on what is happening on the property next door.
Jay,
Yes.
No, no, Jack.
what's the bonding process for an abutter who wants to appeal, if it's approved?
The bonding process?
Yeah, in other words, what isn't it, to something like 200% of all of the contractor's costs for the term of the appeal? And what can, I don't know if Mr.
There is no requirement for
You're saying
one way of
statute,
standing to file an appeal of the
But there's a
planning
requirement.
board decision.
there's a requirement in the statute to pay the bond.
Yeah.
If you, the individual, have to pay the bond, not like under 40B, I don't know if there is a bonding requirement under 40B, but under 40R, the individual, all of the butters, they would have to file bonds, and it's up to 200% times, I guess, all of your soft costs, or whatever your costs would be for the pendency of that appeal. You're just glossing over that. You're not talking.
I'm not glossing over it at all.
Well, look at it in the statute, it's in the statute.
John, let me ask, you mentioned 40B a couple times. Let me run a scenario by you, just because I'm curious.
Well, I know because it's 7, go ahead.
May I ask my question?
Yes,
Thank you.
go ahead.
You live right next door, okay, you live right next door to the community center.
Right, and they have a right of way,
They do.
right,
So for
which they have
you,
never.
as you and I have chatted about, your concern is, whoa, what goes in there? I got to share it right away.
Right.
Under
Plus-
40R, we've explained tonight, that is going to be addressed. May not be to your satisfaction, but it's going to be addressed. Don, under 40B, if a project says, boy, I want that 5.7 acres, Don?
Yes.
I want that 5.7 acres on the community center. 40B right now, without 40R, is valid zoning law here in Adams. They can go right in there, do what they want to do, and you have no say. Is that what you want?
Well, then I can appeal it, I don't have to pay that 200%. And getting back to my driveway, I put up with a lot with that driveway. Town never really, with all of the traffic going in there, the holes and everything, I would always have to ask to have it repaired. They never really repaired it.
So let's discuss 40R in Adams, the bylaw. How's it going to look? Breakdown of districts and units. The individual properties were grouped into 4 districts based on historical and current land use. We have districts A, B, C, and D. A is Park Street, B are former schools or current schools, C are mills, D is developable land. The potential number of units, and remember, when we say potential, think synonymously aspirational. 27 units could be built Park Street, 204 on schools identified, 278 on the mills, 120 on developable land. That gives us the total of 629, which trips that $600,000 mark. guess Kevin had a separate, we don't have the actual zoning over the map. But for those of you who remember, it's color coded, and you can, it might be available still online in the bylaw, or we can certainly provide it to you. But as it's broken out, each of those four, as I just said, have a specific color code and identifies the individual properties. Now, George, I know you had asked me previously, how were those properties identified? Do you still need the answer to that question?
I have an additional question.
But do you need that question answered? Because we're prepared tonight.
How were they
to-
identified?
Yes.
You would explain how they were.
Okay.
You had a choice.
As long as you got your answer.
How were they identified?
That's what I'm concerned about.
The group of planning board and Donna Season went through and reviewed properties and identified those properties.
And
Go
my
ahead, George,
property
your next
wasn't
question.
considered?
I'm sorry?
And my property wasn't considered?
I don't know what your property is. so-
These were just to summarize, these were properties that in the past 10, 15 years had all been discussed as future housing at one time or another. So that's why the planning board and staff kind of came to this collective list of properties.
So,
New question, George. Go ahead.
yes, this is an awful lot of properties being involved in this action. We have no idea what's going to happen with this. We have a wishful thinking that good developments are going to come and we're going to prosper. But it's the entire, we don't know. You don't know. It's a guess. And we're playing with a lot of property here, 19 properties, large properties, impactful properties. And I think that the town is taking a very large, ambitious step, first step in this process. I would strongly recommend that the planning board and the town consider one property or maybe two properties they think are feasible to develop at this point. Do those two properties or do the one property, see how those play out. If they're profitable, if they work, then the town will be, I will be more anxious to do more properties. But to go into this commitment, it's a 30-year commitment.
So where does that 30-year number come from?
I think it's a requirement that all properties that adopt or use for 30 or 40R have an obligation for 30 years to
Yep.
provide
Correct.
low affordable housing
Yeah.
in those units.
There's an affordability restriction if a project is approved by the planning board. So if a developer comes forward, if he proposes a project, if the planning board approves the project, those 20 to 40% of the overall units that are affordable have a 30-year affordability
Right.
restriction. The same way the town now, in operating the Adams Housing Rehabilitation Program, we have a 15-year affordability restriction on any project done under housing rehab. So the state just requires a longer duration.
Sure, and the reason for that is that in a higher density population like Boston, it's hard to control costs. So a developer takes this project on, takes on a 40R unit. It keeps affordable housing in those areas more reasonable.
Right.
We don't have that problem here. We aren't
It's to
battling
avoid
affordable housing.
speculation, that's basically what it is. It's to avoid speculative development where a developer comes in, takes advantage of the incentives, and then flips it later for a higher cost. It makes sure the units that are designated as affordable
I understand
remain
that.
affordable.
I understand.
Yes, sir.
What is the rent range for affordable? First, 1,500 to 1,800 a month for, is that market rate?
Market rate housing is what I was
Is
referring to.
1,500 and up or so?
Affordable housing rates are generally set by government regulators, whether they be state or federal.
Do you have any numbers?
Steve, you guys just posted something about your stratification for your proposed units. What, do you know the answer to that?
It's based on income, and it ranges, the federal number is given, but just because that's the range of the rent, doesn't mean that that is what the rent is going to be. And that's the maximum rent, so.
Okay, so someone was, a single person making $45,000, any idea what this?
I do. Someone in the 45 is the range.
So the range is 669 to 1,400 for a 4-bedroom. So if you're speaking about an efficiency, which is usually one large room, it's 669, 1-bedroom, 815, 2-bedroom, 1,026, 3-bedroom, 1,309, 4-bedroom, 1,428.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Just speaking to that, with the demand side, the market rate units, there's significant demand for in the Berkshires, and particularly Pittsfield, Adams, and North Adams, because a big project went online in the cable mills in Williamstown. This particular resource, 40R, is creating a program that obligates a certain percentage of units to be affordable housing, but it creates incentives for the development of the market rate units, which is the higher percentage of the units. And that helps close that gap for developers that David was talking about earlier. And in Adams, without a program like this, you're not seeing hardly any organic market rate development. That's not happening on its own right now without some of these tools. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yes, sir.
Just a quick question on, of the A, B, C, and D, the areas, how many of those buildings have been vacant for, how many are vacant?
Donna, go ahead.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know, but a lot of them.
The majority of them?
Right.
Correct.
And they've been sitting there for years,
Correct.
some of them.
Correct.
So they're aging, and
Correct.
the cost of just trying to keep them up is enough. Okay.
I mean, we're about to issue a request for proposals for the classroom wing of Memorial School. I would look forward to having this as an incentive to attract private developers to put in proposals for the development of housing at the school. That's going to allow us to, by providing that 70,000 square foot of building, but it'll allow the town to retain the gym and some other portions of the building for community use for future generations. I think that's an important trade-off.
Yes, ma'am.
So what Donna's saying, she'd like to have the Memorial School, a developer there. Why not just put Memorial School on 40R and maybe 7th Music and phase this process?
That's a planning board question.
Yeah.
For the planning board.
It is a planning board question.
Any other general questions that we can answer? We haven't answered. It's a lot of information, so we're aware of that. Somebody new? Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. Being a butter to the construction or the demolition of the Commercial Street School, I want to tell you, it scares me to death to think that several buildings would be working there, because I think I might make a few enemies now, and I don't mean to, but I think our town hall departments did a lousy job of keeping track of what was being done on that property.
In terms of
Well,
the Commercial
if you
Street
rode
School?
down Commercial Street and had to stop because of the dust that you couldn't see to drive, our home, for instance, and they were using a garden hose, a household garden hose.
And it's my understanding that once the complaint came into town hall, the building inspector went over and shut them down. And
Why
notified
weren't
the
they there
DPP.
before checking? So how, if we have several demolitions going on, if they did such a lousy job on that little school?
Well, I think 40R, the intent is not to demolish buildings. I think the intent of 40R is for reuse, again, using the Berkshire Mill building. I think that's the intent of 40R. So I think as a community and as a town government, our intent is to preserve our historic buildings and not demolish them. And then as a town administrator, I'm just gonna, because we're gonna get off topic with this, but I'm sorry, I don't think the building commissioner can be everywhere and anywhere. And I remember that issue, and I know that as soon as the complaint came in, and Deb, I think you might have been the one to take the complaint, he was dispatched immediately. So I'm sorry, but I take exception to that. I think the town responded as soon as we were aware of it. I don't think he was sitting there in the corner. He got there as soon as he can. Any questions? I want to keep this
The
about
work
40
was stopped for a week and a half. Why was the
Ma'am,
that stopped?
we're happy to talk about this afterward for you, and I apologize for the inconvenience that you had with that, but we'll talk about it afterward, for sure. And Jerry is happy to speak with you, and I think also if another demolition happens, I will send the building commissioner over
Keep a better
periodically.
eye on what's going on.
Anything about, yes, ma'am?
Just to clarify, because I think there may still be some confusion, and I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. The affordable housing component of this does not include Section 8.
Correct.
They're two different things. So there's no Section 8 involved in any of this. It's affordable, which is a reduced rent for based on income, and then there's market rent.
It tends to be new hires, people like Jay said, first job in the district attorney's office, school teachers, police officers, new hires at General Dynamics. That tends to be the clientele in the affordable housing market.
If you look at Vermont, I believe Vermont uses a different term for it. I want to say they call it workforce.
Yep.
They will call it workforce housing.
It's characterized that way in some parts of the country, different terminology.
And there's no way that they could say, okay, we've got some empty spaces, so we're going to slide some Section 8s in there. I think that's a big concern, because you've got, increased students in the schools and things like that, and people not working. And so if it doesn't include Section 8, I think that takes a big concern away.
It does. If you have an affordable unit and someone with a voucher comes, you're required to accept that voucher.
I believe you can't discriminate.
You can't discriminate. So, if a development has done units and they can't lease them, you can go to Section 8.
So they can go. All right.
Don?
I don't know the numbers. Yeah, I just don't know the numbers well enough to comment on it.
I can't. I don't know.
I mean, a property owner, a landlord has to be willing to accept Section 8, this ability to enforce the issue. No, you cannot do that. And you have to meet requirements. There has to be, requirements for the apartment. There has to be requirements for the individual that has the voucher. There are requirements for the owner of the building. So there's, again, I think it was said earlier, these projects, as they're proposed, there's no incentive for the developer to be doing Section 8. And I don't see where there'd be all these empty units, because they've done their marketing studies to begin with, and going forward, as Mr. Carver said.
I think one of the points I made at the last meeting that I didn't make tonight is that this zoning overlay could lie dormant. Town meeting could pass it, it could be on the books, and the economics never change for a developer to come in and say, we're gonna do a 40R project. Alternatively, you could have a parcel with 40R on it that permits a particular project under 40R, but then the underlying zoning is better for them, and they use the underlying zoning.
Yeah, there's another dynamic here at work that I just want to respond to in terms of the Section 8. If Section 8 drove housing outcomes, we'd have lots of it. If the revenues that drive the Section 8 program created the proper incentive to the market, we'd have lots more of it, and we don't. There's a shortage of Section 8. And no one is gonna plan on Section 8 rentals to make a project in these properties work. They're just not gonna be able to finance it. The reach is too far. I think that when you heard Dave speak about the structural gap between foundational costs to develop in Massachusetts and the rents in this market, that dynamic is not conducive to a Section 8 facility. Just not gonna happen.
Any questions on any topics that hasn't been discussed in the context of 40R?
Could I just follow up with Don, real quick? Don, is there a private capital financial requirement under 40R? Is there a percentage, dollar amount or anything, that they are required other than government money?
No, as a matter of fact, 40R does not address the financing of a project in any way.
So it could be all government.
Well, You'd be much more attractive to government programs that I understand if you were doing 40B. That's the process, because they have limited dividend, qualified limited dividend companies that qualify, maximize the qualification for state support of affordable housing. It's a different animal altogether. You're not gonna mix and match like that
That's true then.
in these.
Why is 7 Hoosick not, why hasn't it gone?
Gone what?
Why hasn't it developed? Because I think they're saying, one of the reasons why 40B is available, 40R is coming in here. It's gonna make it easier to try and develop that property under 40R rather than 40B, if I'm following what you were saying, Jay.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think all these projects are more doable under 40R. The soft costs in 40B projects that I've been involved in are huge.
And the bonding,
Not the bonding, the costs
the
of.
bonding to the individual.
No,
The
you're talking,
individual
you're
isn't
mixing
gonna do
two,
it.
mixing two different things. I'm talking about, look, David said it earlier, if you have other people's money, cost is no object, and that's what you see often in 40B projects. They are expensive. They are expensive because the profit motivation is limited in it. So, attracting private capital is a better long-term solution, at least in my opinion, for the town of Adams or anybody else. And
Has
that's
it
what
been?
40I is about.
Have there been any appeals of 40R?
I have no idea.
I
Yeah.
was gonna say, it might be helpful if the panel commented on how long a project like 7 Hoosick, Plunkett, condominiums, how long these projects take, especially when you're using older buildings that have historic, historic issues. They a lot of times have brownfields issues, and it's a process. I think I've heard that it's an average of, 7 to 9 years to develop a mill building or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely confirm that that's a typical time frame that we see around the whole county, whether it's here or it's in other communities. And it's that whole, it's that whole layering of reasons. The thing with 40R is that typically when buildings sit and a process takes a while, it's the financing piece that is slow to come together. 40R provides a tool that helps with that gap. And I actually, one thing that just occurred to me when we were talking is another benefit of the program that's indirect is that when a property is labeled, is identified under 40R, if it's in the hands of a developer that is not in a position to do anything with their own private capital or is struggling to gain financing otherwise, it actually adds value to their property, which increases the chances of them getting it out of their hands, in the hands of somebody that might do something with it. And we all know in Adams, we've seen that and we're seeing that. So it's a positive.
Okay, we're coming up on 7:28, so I want to stay true to my word, to keep this to about 90 minutes rather than I think the 2.5 that we had the last time. Any questions on any topic about 40R that we have not hit or that still remains ambiguous to you? We're doing, this is all new to me, so I'm doing my best to explain it. It's a learning curve for myself, and we have really a lot of the experts here. So I prefer to keep this to a question that we can answer. I know everyone has their opinion, and that is important, and town meeting and the planning board and the selectmen want to hear that, but for tonight, my job is to communicate this out. Because as we've recognized before, as we admitted before, when this rolled out, it rolled out without really effective communication, I think, on the planning board and on the town's part. So we wanted to be sure that we stopped it, we heard everybody, and we said, let's make sure we get some facts and figures out here. So let's keep it to a question, and then we'd like to wrap up so we can let our speakers go. Yes, sir.
My question earlier, Jay, was about the numbers. What's the characteristic of the town? How many private sector homes do we have? How many apartments? And how much affordable housing do we have already? We already have, I believe, met the state standards. I was looking at several websites on what's affordable in this town. And you haven't presented us with any hard facts and numbers to say we need more affordable housing in this town. Moresi developed his mill in North Adams pretty quick. The Greylock Mill is on its way. You can't wait 5 more minutes for another wave, then maybe you should be surfing behind a powerboat. And that's not the way I like to surf. I
Well,
like
I'll
natural waters
I'll
that
answer.
rise all boats.
I've been to Dave's building, and Dave was supposed to be here tonight, but again, he had a previous engagement. That's not residential, that's commercial.
So what's wrong with that for Adams?
Why hasn't it been done yet?
Give it time, give it time. The mills have to fill up next to Mass Mocha for that wave to reach here. Be patient. You made it past Heartbreak Hill on the Boston Marathon. Don't do steroids now. You don't need this shot in the arm. Just relax and wait, people.
How long
We've
do
come
you
a
wait?
long way
How
together.
long do you wait? We've been waiting for
I've been waiting
these
33
homes.
years since I came here
Oh,
for
I
the
know you
Glen.
have, yeah.
And you know what? I can wait another 5. You won't recognize this town if the 40R goes through.
And if it doesn't, and
Like
then you
Ross
wait another
Perot,
10
you'll hear
years.
the great sucking sound.
I just heard that, we just heard that Ross Perot bit on the radio today. Any other particular questions? At 11:30, I'd like to respect these folks. Sandy, did I see folks, do you have a hand up?
I was just wondering if the 40R gets approved, does that put any restrictions on any other programs that might be available for our town?
If anything, if the town meeting adopts 40R, it'll open us up to more. The problem that we face as a community is when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts opens a wallet, at some point, it's almost the same argument that a private developer has. When you ask for money from someone else's money, it comes with strings. And what we're finding is with the state, and as Don has educated me on, when we do these grant programs that we rely a lot on, that checkbox is there. It's the same thing with the sewer fee. And again, I don't want to take a left-hand turn, but it's the same scenario. Is Adams has been status quo for a period of time, and as the Commonwealth and other communities advance and move around us, I feel we have an obligation to keep up with it. And although this process started before I became town administrator, I feel it's important that at a minimum, and it's up to town meetings, not up to me, but I feel it's important to get that information out there. We wouldn't be doing our due diligence if we didn't take a look at it, both pros and cons. Because when the state says, on their community development grants, are you or are you not a 40R community? That, Don, am I misspeaking?
No.
That's something that we need to consider. So it doesn't, if we don't, I think one way to phrase it, if we don't do anything, we kind of know what we have. If we adopt it, we don't know what the benefit's going to be. It might sweeten the deal for somebody. That's one way to look at it. You know, I'm not up here to editorialize. I'm here to communicate. But that's what one person said to me. Well, we know what we got now, Jay. Let's see what we got with 40R. I think one of the things with 40R that comforts me is the fact that the underlying zoning is still there. It doesn't. It as an option. It doesn't undercut it. Some of the planning board members have commented that to me, saying that's important for them. Anything else that we haven't touched on at all?
When does this go to vote?
There's no town, as of right now, the next town meeting's not set until the statutory requirement, which is June. I believe we talked about before about having a separate town meeting, so this is just dealt with. And this isn't the first, I'm gonna tell everybody now, this is not the first zoning change that the planning board and zoning board is looking at. Our zoning right now prohibits us from being able to move on certain projects. It hasn't been changed in years. So the planning board is starting to look comprehensively at some zoning changes so we can begin to compete and attract development. I'm often told, Jay, we got to expand the tax base. Yes, we do. I either cut the budget more to save you money and reduce services. And I can tell you, having been here for 7 months, I don't know what more I can cut without compromising the services that you pay for. So on the flip side, how do we expand the tax base? Jonathan, how do you expand the tax base in a community?
More people, more kids in the schools.
Which brings business. I think Steven's going to tell you, who owns a prime piece of property on Park Street, that if we had more residents in the downtown area, he's going to find somebody, I think, a lot faster for his space. I know you have plans for it, I'm just generalizing, so please don't read into that. But that's what we're trying to do here. There's no, I said at the last meeting, there's no nefarious plot or man behind the curtain. I can assure you that everybody at Town Hall works incredibly hard to make sure that this community moves forward, retains our heritage, retains our pride, and moves forward in a competitive way. And I know that as your town administrator, I don't want to sit there and watch other communities grow while we continue to struggle and continue to talk about the same problems. But again, it's up to town meeting as to whether or not this is approved. So I want you to take away from this tonight is an informational session. We wanted to provide you with the information as to why the town is looking at this. That is the takeaway. Town hall staff remains available at all times to answer any questions that you have. There's plenty of information online. And I know that Donna, I know our selectmen are, or two of our selectmen are here tonight. Anyone's happy to talk to you about it. Anything else before we wrap up? Gail?
Just two questions, informational, like affordable housing, and you had the diagram of what they can make and et cetera. Would people be closed out of affordable housing if they made too much money?
If they make too much money, then they pay market rate. If they don't qualify.
Okay,
for
so
this-
what part of this is upscale housing? Any of it, just affordable?
No, it's not an affordable program. It is a smart growth overlay district that says 20% minimum has to be affordable. It's not an affordable program. Am I mischaracterizing it, Tom?
No.
And how long has this been on the books? 2004 to 2005.
And the intent of 40R at its core, and I think it's certainly what I understand the town to be most interested in, is that it attracts market rate housing investment.
Correct.
That's what you want. That's what really strengthens your tax base, what really strengthens your financial position.
Anything else, folks? Thank you for your patience and your attention.